I'm Shelley Poticha. I am the director of the Urban Solutions Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I've been a member of the Congress for the New Urbanism for, this is our 25th year, so I've been a member for 23 years. And I had a lovely opportunity to be the executive director for a number of years. So that's one reason why I'm so excited about talking about how we make diversity a higher priority in our movement. And what we are going to do here today is have a conversation. We have an incredible panel here. These are superstars. And we need to, I'm really interested in hearing what people have to say. And the format is going to be really kind of relaxed and conversational. We're not going to do a series of presentations, but we have some slides that help kind of drive home some of the concepts. We'll also open it up for all of you to ask questions and hopefully get a little bit more of a dialogue going. So that's why we're in this kind of interesting format where I'm sitting at the edge of the table. So let me introduce our panelists and then a little bit of the framing of what we're here to talk about today. To my right is Emily Talen. She's a professor of urban studies at the University of Chicago. She's taught at many universities around the country and has been involved in the new urbanism for so many years, but also really pushing all the time to have us really confront some of the kind of key unanswered questions that might be uncomfortable to talk about. So I'm really appreciative that she agreed to do this. Ron Sims is the retired Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also former King County executive in this region. Ron and I worked together, served together in the first term of the Obama administration, and I think one of the things that really was so heartwarming to me was his commitment to confronting the issues of diversity and the systemic racism or the implications of some of our core policies that have led to some really poor outcomes for people in communities, which is part of what we're going to be talking about. And then Justin Garrett Moore, he's the executive director of the New York City Public Design Commission. And this is the first time we're meeting. We talked on the phone earlier, a fellow traveler, and he also has come just for today from the East Coast. So this is a very important opportunity to have a chance to talk to him about some of the work that he's been doing, particularly with the American Planning Association. So this is an issue that many organizations are starting to really pay attention to. So getting to the subject, we know it is very clear that there is a lack of diversity in the urban design and planning fields. And it's in one implication of that is that it is impacting the work that we do. And we already are starting to learn through the feedback we get from people in communities, through the research and data, that low-income communities and communities of color often have disproportionately poor health impacts, have less opportunity to access jobs, have a lot of knocks against them. And yet, we're hoping to explore the linkage between our work and our commitment to improving the lives of everyone in our communities and that lack of diversity in our talent pool. And how can we really make a commitment to building a kind of pipeline of talent in the design and planning fields that better reflects the diversity of America and America's cities. And I will also bring to this that I've been working for the last 3.5 years in the environmental movement, which this issue is coming up as well, where, for decades, the environmental movement kind of sees its mission as protecting icebergs and polar bears, which is super important. But it's not been all that relevant to what people care about every day, like how much it costs to get to work, or how much energy we use, and how much our electric bills are. And the environmental movement is really starting to confront that. And it has led to a deep set of conversations in my organization, both about how in fact we can bring a diverse pool of staff to bear on these issues. So it's about hiring. It's also about how we create an inclusive culture in our organization so that different voices are welcomed, even if they bring difficult conversations. And then maybe the kind of even more difficult question, at least in my organization, is how would we advocate for different policies if equity was at the core of our values? And what changes as a result of that? Just an example, again, from the kind of energy sector is it's probably faster, easier to reduce energy use if you're focusing on big commercial buildings and making sure they're energy efficient. You can also kind of plug and play with big commercial building owners. But there's low-income households in America spend 4 times proportionally the amount of income on just heating and cooling their homes, than average households, and that's disproportionately people of color. And so we're now looking at a whole initiative that's really focused on energy efficiency in affordable multifamily housing as a way of balancing out the way that we that we go out and advocate for policies, so that it really does promote more equitable outcomes. It's not just about energy efficiency. So we'll continue to circle back to these issues of the connection between what's happening in communities, how we can do better as a community to build the perspectives and the understanding and awareness in our work, and what are some of the solutions to that. So what we talked about was kind of doing a series of rounds. And I wonder if we might start with you, Emily. Kind of how does this relate to the interests and concerns of CNU members? And what are some of the kind of history notes in this? And if you want to pull up your slide, whenever you're ready for that, you could do that, right?
Okay, I have kind of a bummer slide, so I won't start with
Okay, yeah.
That's the bummer slide?
No. I like the bummers.
Possibly.
It's a call to action. It's a call to action.
Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, first, I want to say thank you, Shelley, for that great introduction. I want to say that I've been coming to CNU a long time, and I have never seen so many sessions on the topic of diversity, affordability, inclusive, equity.
Yay! Must be Seattle.
Amazing. It's just amazing, and it's really, really great. because there's a lot of people out there involved in this diversity conversation, but there's nobody but the CNU, I think, that's really tying it to built environment. That's what we do. That's kind of, that's our thing, as you know. Just a couple of points I'll make. I do want to say that diversity is a word that can become very annoying. Like, it just gets thrown around. Same with equity, same with sustainability. So I think we do need to be careful. While I love all the focus and attention, we need to make sure we don't get diversity fatigue. And this happened when I was at Arizona State in sustainability. We had so many conversations about what is sustainability that people were just tuning out.
Yeah.
So let's try to do that. I have my own definition of things, and I don't know if I can get others to buy into it, but I think that when we're talking about diversity, it might be a good idea to sort of think of it in two streams. One is how to be more inclusive and diverse professionally, organizationally, and that, I think the focus there needs to be about people of color and having more diversity racially and ethnically. I think when we're talking about the built environment, it really is more about a focus on income diversity. And there's a lot of reasons for focusing on that, and I have a book on that topic.
Well, there you go.
Which you have to all
Okay.
go by. So anyway, and if we're talking about, and by the way, there's an old adage that neighborhoods can be racially and ethnically diverse or income diverse, but they are very rarely both of those things at the same time. And that is exactly how the data is playing out, and it's kind of a bummer, but I think maybe that's a reality to be dealt with. The other thing is, if you're talking about income diversity in the built environment, I think our conversations necessarily go to affordability, and that's why these things are getting all sort of intermixed together. But I don't disagree with that approach. So on the professional front, I'll just mention that I'm a planning educator. We have had discussions about how to make planning education, architecture education, more racially and ethnically diverse for a really long time. There's a whole literature. There are proposals about what to do, how to get more African American instructors, students, and I don't know what progress has been made. I'll only tell you that conversation's been going on a long time. So on the historical front, just quickly, I want to make the point that this conversation about on the built environment side, how to make the built environment both beautiful and high quality and inclusive and diverse and therefore affordable. That's been going on since the 19th century. And so I'm really glad we're keeping up the conversation here, but it is important to recognize that each generation, since the dawn of this profession we call urban design and urban planning, came on board in the late 19th century, that conversation has been going on. Ebenezer Howard was into it. Raymond Unwin in his book Town Planning was into it. The modernists came along in the 1930s. That was their agenda as well. We might really disagree with their particular approach and their outcomes, but Corbusier was interested in making diversity and non-segregated places. Of course, we had the new towns that came on board. Jane Jacobs had her critique. The 1980s, the 1990s, Shelley doing all her amazing work in the Obama administration. So all these conversations have been happening, and I think that's all a great thing. And I'm just saying it's important to recognize that there is that whole history. In New Urbanism itself, about 10 years ago, it might be a little longer. Is Neil Payton here? He and I were the co-chairs of the CNU Affordability Initiative, which could just as well have been called the Diversity Initiative. And we had all these conversations, and we wrote white papers, and I dug them up, and I started to look through them a little bit, and there were some good ideas there. I can't say that something about federal policy needing to be more, relax the regulations, the usual kind of stuff, and having more integration with the land trust, the community land trust movement, which has been a really creative way to build in affordability. And I was asking Neil last night, do you think we accomplished anything with that? And why did we stop talking? Why did we stop having that initiative? And he said, I learned so much, he said. And so just having the conversation, just talking it through and having a forum where you can have that way of talking with people with similar interests is really valuable. And I thought it was a good point that he made. How long am I allowed to ramble?
Well, let's move on to other folks, and then we'll come
sure.
back to you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So, Ron, the implications of policy on people's lives is a big focus of your thinking for quite a long time. And can you talk a little bit about, what do you see as some of the dots that need to be connected, and what kind of experience from King County or HUD that you'd like to offer?
I had the honor of being the county executive here. It's an elected office, but we're the regional government. There are 38 cities in King County, including Seattle. We do all the our responsibilities are all the regional issues: growth management, transportation systems. It was never dull. Clean water, clean air. It was just never dull. And but I always had a philosophy that I should let smart people be smart. So. And I loved it. And I also had a rule of employment. I said, if you took a risk and you succeeded, I would sing your praises to the end of the universe. If you took a risk and failed, I would applaud you to the end of the universe. If you took no risk at all, I'd make it a very miserable work day. And the idea was to have people bubble up really good ideas, and they did. So I will tell you some issues that we worked through, and then an issue and all of them built up to some significant consequences. We were working with the University of British Columbia, and we had transportation planners, land use planners, and health planners that we gathered. And the issue is, could we predict the likelihood of a heart attack by commute time? It was very simple. So all of these were really superbly talented planners. They knew this stuff really well. So after 3 months, I asked for an update, and he said, we're still working on it. Then after 6 months, I asked for, I was invited to encourage people to work together. I'll never forget going to a meeting and saying, you're all very smart, but you guys are arguing. And so I hope that you can just focus on the task. Can we predict a heart attack by a commute time? Then after 9 months, I went in to talk to them and said long-term employment is going to be based upon an answer. So that, and that is because they never got out of their silos. Health planners knew health. Transportation planners knew transportation. Land use knew land use, but they never, no matter how skilled they were used to talking to each other. At the end of their work, we got our first report, and it said if you're commuting for more than an hour of work today, we can predict heart attacks and a lot of them were by age 72. Who was going to have a heart attack and who was not by age 72? And so as a result of that, because King County was also responsible for growth management, we began to tighten and reduce long-term commute and investment, and then augmented it by using public transportation over those distances. And there's still a lot of work to be done. So that was my first little tweak with looking at how urban areas should be developed. Later on, and much later, there was an African-American think tank in Washington, D.C. named the Joint Center. And they did a report on African Americans and said that young people, that 36% of African American males under the age of 30 would have nothing in common with America except their ultimate death. And so we were talking about this huge divide. I brought it back here, the report. I went back with my family and told my kids to go to the press conference they were having and then bring back only one piece of paper. And they brought back boxes of them. And so they had this wonderful man that I had the sheer luxury of working with. His name is Chandler Felt. He had a voice that I envied. Just this perfect, deeply resonant voice. So I gave Chandler this data and said, Chandler, can you look at all this data that was gathered by the Joint Center and let me know where that's occurring in Seattle? So I went back a couple of months later, because he was in my executive office. I said, Chandler, how are we doing? And he said, we're doing well. That's it. Now, I learned not to push smart people, because I know they're still thinking. So I went back up to 6 months, and I said, things looking good? Things are looking great. But Chandler was just diligent. He knew how to look at data and take data beyond what you would normally give him. So after 9 months, I said, Chandler, really, how are we doing here? And he said, in a couple of months, we'll have it done. And in a couple of months, they did. And we came out with a report. We looked at all of the jurisdictions in Seattle by zip code. And we found out that we could predict with absolute mathematical certainty life outcomes. How much they would earn, when they would die, likelihood of death, what they were likely to die of, whether they were going to be as juveniles, as school kids, where they would in fact be kicked out of school or not kicked out of school. It was just all of this life-determining data by zip code. When I went back to HUD, it was Shelley's task then to actually perfect the model, which he did incredibly well, which is to take it nationwide and look at every single jurisdiction. And when we finished at HUD, the report to the president was that there was no doubt at all that zip codes were not an address. They were life determinants. What influences that life determination was intriguing. When I came back here and retired, I decided to be a volunteer. It's easier to make mischief that way. And so I chaired the Dean's Committee at University of Washington School of Public Health. And I was asked to attend a meeting that they had with the science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And not that I knew anything about genetics, because I did not. And I had no idea why I was going to this meeting, other than the fact that the dean of the school said I should go to the meeting. So I'm sitting there, and it was really interesting. Science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, actually does a lot of work with the World Health Organization. And he had an interesting thing to say that triggered an avalanche of issues. He asked me to stand up, which I kept thinking, why? And he said, have you ever been on a diet? And I was looking, yes. Have you ever failed? I mean, do you gain weight, lose weight? I mean, are you the yo-yo like everybody else in America is? I said, yes, so proud. I gain it and I lose it. And he says, when you see a starving baby, when you see a starving mother, what does the baby look like? And I said, emaciated. I said it with very confidence. He said, you are wrong. The baby's fat. It has collected a lot of what you would call in America bad fat cells because it's in a storage mode. And he said, like you gain weight, lose weight, gain weight, lose weight, but every time you regain the weight, you regain a higher percentage of bad fat cells. That's what you call them. Because your body believes it goes from starvation to being full, and starvation to being full. And so he talked about what we call the genetics of it. So the very next day, I went back up I had a meeting actually at UW with the dean and another friend, a person named Dr. David Fleming, who is who I was able to recruit away from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for a short time, and he went to PATH. And I said, golly, I talked to my wife for 2 hours. I figured out a problem. And he said, what was it? I said, it was really interesting. HUD got sued a lot. And, but there was one suit that was really peculiar to me. It was the Thompson Case in Baltimore, Maryland. In that case, was a group of 8 African-American women who decided that they were being denied the opportunity to move out of previously segregated neighborhoods. They sued and said it was unconstitutional to confine them, and that HUD was a participant in it along with the Baltimore Housing Authority. And I said, but I was at a table, and there was a woman from Johns Hopkins. She said, I got some really cool data. The plaintiffs in the Thompson case, the one you're trying to settle? I said, yes. She says, well, I did a survey of them. I got to do a study for my thesis. And the women's lives did not change economically, but their kids had nothing in common with their mothers in terms of life outcomes. And so I said, tell me about, she says, they moved into better neighborhoods. So I said, it's really interesting. When I was up at UW, I said, you know, I bet you the built environment has consequential influences over people's genes.
Yes.
Because I learned that, I thought you were born with it and it never changed. But that's not true. Your genes change all the time. And they're influenced by any number of factors. That's why we've been able to survive as a species. We assume that our chromosomes are constant. 60% aren't, 40% are. And that's the 40% are 8 parts. But it was really interesting. So I said, the built environment influences. I will tell you to this day that anybody involved in planning processes and building processes and studies, if you are not willing to acknowledge that people are fooling around with people's genes without their permission, you're not telling the truth, because it's done all the time. And the real issue is, can you alter the built environment sufficiently enough so that what we would call the genetic changes taking place manifest themselves positively? I'll give you an example for school children, and I'll close on this one.
Okay.
If a child has high cortisol, they can't learn in school. So we spent billions of dollars berating parents and teachers and educational systems that they were not teaching children how to learn, without realizing that if that child is in a hostile environment, and a hostile environment means that sidewalks are not wide, it's poorly lit, there's no vegetation. I mean, there's a whole series of things called, contrary to our development, that those children cannot learn. We should have spent those billions of dollars restoring neighborhoods that would have been a far better, far more powerful, and far more effective investment in dollars for not only their parents, but for the kids. I'll stop on that.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Justin, tell us a little bit about how you're looking at this issue, and maybe even weave in some of the challenges that you think are part of that.
Right. I'm going to zoom past your slides.
We'll come back to that, don't worry.
Right. So what I'll try to do is to kind of weave a point from both Emily and Ron. You mentioned kind of the legacy of Corbusier and the people building the city, and then we have the legacy of the zip code. Well, the issue is that there were people, like people in this room, like people in other rooms, that draw those plans, they draw those zip codes, they determine what those factors are. And the main issue is that the people who are drawing those lines do not reflect the people that are affected by those lines. Right? That's the big question. So I put up the Jane Jacobs quote, so 1961, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And so everyone in this room knows that sounds very good, but that it's very difficult to do for a lot of different reasons. But it's an important point to kind of underline what the base dilemma is, right? Who is creating our city? Who is deciding, and how does that happen? So that was 1961. 1968, Whitney Young goes to the AIA. He was the head of the Urban League, and he goes to the AIA, the architects group, and he says, you, as a group of people, which was predominantly white men, are having a huge impact on what is happening to our cities. This is the white man's roads through black men's homes, right? So he goes to the AIA and he tells them, you need to do better. Fast forward, it's 2017. Some of you probably have heard about what's going on with the AIA for a lot of different reasons, but the conversation that was started in 1968 has seen very little change and impact, right? So there's this arc of, we had an African-American president. The AIA is still only less than 2% of its membership are black people, right? So, AIA feels bad. They invite Michelle Obama. Her first speaking engagement is to go to the AIA and to talk about who is in the profession, the diversity of the profession, both in terms of people of color and for women still, right? So this is a structural problem that has happened, and it's not like we haven't been talking about it, but the conversations that we actually need to have aren't happening, right? So the conversation, and this goes to Emily's point about diversity, everyone at these organizations will say diversity is important, but what are they actually going to do about it? They don't have the conversation about what they actually are going to do about it, right? So I think that's the kind of the underlying question and aspect. And so when Michelle Obama goes and she's having the conversation with the head of the AIA, they're talking about the pipeline of talent that comes into the field, into the profession, but also I think a conversation about exposure and access. So when you talk about opportunity, the zip code question, how are you designing for opportunity? How are you planning for opportunity? And there are a lot of different ways to do that. So obviously financial commitments and investments are one component, but access to decision making, access to power, and what we call being at the table. Michelle Obama gets to be at the table with the head of the AIA. Who gets to be at the table in the work that you're doing? Mm-hmm. So these are some key kind of questions and responsibilities. I think that, it almost rises to the level of ethics, mm-hmm. of deciding and determining who gets to be a part of making and planning the city. I can kind of launch into some of the...
Well, let's go back to Emily,
yeah.
and then let's do another loop. So, okay. Emily, connect us back again to the CNU and some of your own, now we have the income diversity slide up, so...
Okay. So the reason I said this was a little depressing is you have to look at what kind of progress is being made here on the income diversity and built environment front. And so one of the first things to do is really confront that reality. I think a lot of people probably know the story that we are making progress on racial and ethnic diversity at the neighborhood level. It's still a very segregated urbanism out there, but progress has been made. Progress has not been made on the income front, and I'm sure you've already heard this story, but just for Chicago, this is over here, 1980, where we were, these are tracts, census tracts, so sort of a proxy for neighborhood. All the green ones had relatively high diversity. And you see by 2010, significant loss of those diverse neighborhoods. Income diversity. And so I think that is something to really confront and figure out what are we doing here? Why in this past 30 years have we not made progress? One of the things going on in new urbanism that I've seen is that there is a tension between built environment approaches to addressing this issue and public subsidy and getting the public sector involved in mitigating this problem. And my dear friend Sandy Sorling reminded me that a few years ago, when was that, Sandy? I don't know, even 10 years ago. We had a little organization called PANU, Progressive Activists for the New Urbanism. And we had hats and T-shirts. And the reason we formed this organization is that we were frustrated that one of the principles in the charter is we build for, income diversity. I don't know the exact quote of that charter principle, but we are all about income diversity, right? And we build for a broad range of incomes and races and everything else. And we felt, us progressive little wing, felt that the response to our failure to achieve that was a strictly built environment kind of approach. We need energy efficiency, we need to build small, we need to have a mix of unit types, all that really good stuff, and no one's against any of that, but the fact is that a lot of these neighborhoods have small units and have a diversity of housing types and have some of those built form characteristics that we so love and admire, and that Jane Jacobs so loved and admired, and it's not panning out. And the reason, we all know the reason, there's incredible demand for these very beautiful places that we're creating with their mix of housing types. Now, this doesn't hold true in every city. Some cities, that built environment approach, having that mix of housing types and smaller lots and everything else, it works. But it just doesn't work everywhere. So I guess my point is that that tension has been going on. I think it's important it seems like maybe we need to do it built environment only folks, I think they lost that debate actually, because I don't know that people are saying that as much now as they used to. I don't know, maybe other people have a different perspective.
Let's keep talking about this. I mean, I'd love to see a layer of race put on that map too, because I mean, the South Side of Chicago is legendary for disparities and discrimination. So, Ron and Justin, what do you see as some of the pathways forward? You want to go for it?
Sorry, I'm a visual person, so I do have like images.
We love
there.
that. Here, you want to pass him down the clicker?
So, a couple points on the, this is the challenges again. I have data for like architects and planners, right? Who's shaping our built environment? So the conversation we often have is about spatial justice, and thinking about who are players in that. So there's obviously, capital, equity, money, that's a key piece of it, but there's regulators, there are practitioners that are involved. So I have two studies I was going to share here. One is the Inclusion in Architecture report. This was done by the J. Max Bond Center at City College. So really great research they did on who's in the profession. 106,000 architects in the U.S., only 15% women, for example. So if we're planning for everybody, for people, which women happen to be the majority, that seems like a question mark, right? In cities, very often a lot of work gets built in cities. The diversity of cities is great. The percentage of African American and Latino together is less than 10% of the profession, so question mark, right? In urban planning, same issue. This is a report called Elephant in the Planning Room from New York. So this is a study of the New York metro region planning context. So this is a place that's very diverse and relatively progressive. Imagine what the numbers are like for the U.S. But the diversity of New York region: 45% white, 18% African American, 10% Asian, 24% Latino. This is who's planning for that region. 71% white. Right, so the disparity shows up in the field itself, with relatively low number of African American and Latino people that are involved in the planning process. And how does that happen? This slide is the most telling one. All the different ways that planning and design happens, right? There's different agencies and there are different modes. So we have our traditional sectors, right? The private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector. The private sector is obviously connected to real estate and money, and look at how tiny these elephants are.
I know. Look at that.
The majority of the work that is connected to capital, that's connected to power and decision making, there is a minuscule number of people that are at the table and involved in that process. So the first thing that we have to do as a way forward is to kind of acknowledge this kind of disparity. So there's the overall aggregate numbers, let's increase what's happening, but the important thing is to look at where decisions are made and where things are happening. You know, public sector, things are a little better, and then nonprofit sector obviously has the best because that's where you see a lot of advocacy organizations. Won't get into it, but obviously the people that are in the private sector side tend to be better compensated, have more professional development opportunities, have better access to grow and gain power and influence in their craft as a profession. The people working in the nonprofits tend to not have those same opportunities. So there is a structural problem here for who has access to even the tools, the information, and the access to plan for their communities. So this is a big part of the challenges, the work and research being done, like by the Bond Center, like Giovanna Terra Christie at New York APA Metro chapter, to say this is what we need to talk about. But the key thing is to, as a way forward, to really focus on what are the ways and methods for us to address this issue, both as kind of professionals and to talk to your clients and your community groups and the politicians, and to think about ways that you can think about diversity in terms of simply who's not just at the table, but who is heading the table, who's facilitating the discussion, whose idea was it to call a meeting in the first place, right? So this is a work we did with Brent Leggs and India Lee. So Brent Leggs is at National Trust for Historic Preservation. India Lee is with the Greater Universities Circle Project in Cleveland for Cleveland Foundation, where they've done a lot of community development work with respect to anchor institutions, right? The big clients, the hospitals and universities in Cleveland. And so this is a meeting that we did in Indianapolis, where I'm from, where we, people from the community, invited these experts to come and to facilitate a discussion about the future of our neighborhood, right? So there's this idea of creating access and opportunity for even starting the conversations, right, before someone else comes and does it, that there's the expertise and networks that are there. And that's something that organizations like the professional organizations or CNU can really be very powerful in facilitating those kinds of exchanges and opportunities for people.
That's great. Ron, do you want to comment on that?
The largest urban area in the state of Washington for people who are poor and of color is a place called North Highline, which is in King County. This goes to criticism on style, to be done. When I went up to the community for the first meeting, a lot of people came, and a lot of people were saying, we've been through this before, and so we yelled at the last person, and we're going to yell at you too. And which was fine, but I remember going back saying, you know, town meetings don't work. You know, for you to come in and say, here's what we'd like to do to your community or for your community, simply is a failed process. And a recent study came out saying town meetings actually don't empower people. And you don't get the people who you want to hear, you get the people who actually know how to do that. So I remember saying, you know, I don't mind being yelled at for 2 hours, but it's not going to move the ball. And so I talked to a police officer who everybody loved. And he said, well, if I were you, I would have contacted the following groups because they're trusted. And he says, they're trusted. And some of them don't get, you know, money from you. They get money through churches. They get money through local businesses. And so we actually gave them all grants and said, it's your job. All we want you to do is to tell us how we can alter the trend line in North Highline. and we're not going to give you performance criteria on the money you get as long as you're out there trying to make a difference. North Highline is diverse. Everybody assumed that everybody of color actually had the same philosophies. That's not true. We had, my wife's my wife's Filipino. To say that Filipinos, Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese all think the same is wrong. If you look at a black person and you say, oh, he's a black person, he might be Eritrean, he may be Nigerian,
Yes.
he may be Ethiopian, he may be Ghanese. And our issue was, why don't we work with people who can get everybody to talk and give us a vision? So part of my issue on what we do wrong on our processes is we don't have a process that listens very well to a community, because if you're not from it and not familiar with whole issues of racial makeup and economic makeup, you assume that the people you're talking to are the right spokespersons, and they're not, because we have a bad habit of not getting people who do have voice to the table. And then as a result, we have problem after problem, delay after delay. The meetings get smaller and smaller and smaller, and people walk away saying, we told you so, you didn't care. And the answer is we didn't, because we didn't take the time to figure out who the voices should be.
That's really good. We could open it up for questions now, or we could, do you want to add something at the end? Yeah, or to sort of pull us together. I know you have a couple more slides.
So, a couple more points. So, I started with the Michelle Obama question, which was about pipeline. Upper left is an image from the South Bronx in 1990. I had a mentor that worked way back with young people doing these kind of workshops with, blocks and things to design their cities. And she used to say that once people know how important their environment is, they can make it better. And so James Rojas, some of you may be familiar with his work. It's essentially the same model that was happening. And what we talk about is the kind of access to this kind of thinking, right? The idea of determining what your place is going to be, that you can be a part of that decision making, and it's something that it is important that it happens with very young people. I'm the head of the city's design commission, African American male, basically a unicorn. How I got into this field is that when I was in high school, I'm from the inner city that everyone talks about. My high school was 97% black. The superintendent at the time had a program that anyone that had a contract with the public school system over a certain dollar amount had to hire students from that school. So when I was freshman in high school, our school had all kind of problems. Our science labs were from like the 70s, but we were getting a $5 million gymnasium for some reason. So there's an architecture firm, and they had to hire me. Right? When I was 14 years old, I was working in an architecture firm every summer, 40 hours a week. So that, that's an opportunity that was created by somebody making a decision that firm, I was probably paid, $1,500, $2,000 over the course of the summer, but that's very minuscule for that firm, right, for the huge contract they were getting. But that's what provides the opportunity. More people need to do and think like that, right? It doesn't cost a lot to create some opportunities for people. The second kind of point was, and this is kind of bridging to some of the work going on in Chicago, Theaster Gates, some of you are probably familiar with his work, where he essentially creates different ways and modes of people getting involved with how their places change. So the Jane Jacobs quote at the beginning, right? People creating their city, what does that mean? What does that look like? It's not always a town hall meeting, planning consultants and an EIS and whatever kind of process. It might be dinners at a vacant house that you transformed. Or it might be simply creating spaces. for different interaction that is valuable to people. So I just wanted to leave with that point that kind of being creative and imaginative about the types of tools that you use to create opportunities for diversity and engagement are very important. That could be a $2,000 fund out of the firm that you have to hire a young person from the community you're working in for the summer, or that could be creating a different type of space for community interaction.
That's really great. That's really good. I'm asking Emily to kind of bring us back to CNU a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for a few minutes of questions.
Yeah, okay, just a few thoughts I had about what it is CNU could be doing to kind of, well, these are my proposals. I would like diversity to be our meta principle, and I think it already kind of is, but I think we can go ahead and just own that and grab that and move forward with that. I think that means that we need to keep measuring, engaging, and figuring out what our successes and failures have been on this front and really, really understanding where we are with it. I would like us to have more targeted definitions. I would like us to not be afraid of really clarifying what we mean when we say diversity and equity and inclusiveness and affordability and all these things that we know work together. I think that we can go ahead and just kind of have more clarity in this discussion. I would like us to take on Jane Jacobs. Now, I know that she is the patron saint of everything we do, but her prescriptions for diversity, which she said was the meta principle, they have not panned out. And I think we need to do more hard look at what's going on here and why is Greenwich Village one of the most non-diverse places there is in terms of income and probably racial and ethnic diversity as well. I would like us to reject easy answers. Like if we would just change the rules, then we would have more diversity in our built environment. It's just simply never that easy. I would like to make sure that no charter award is given to any project that is insensitive to this topic or agnostic on this topic. And I think finally, I would just like us to have a deep spatial awareness about every single thing that we do. Is it helping what we're trying to do, or is it hurting? And so discussions about whether or not gentrification is good or bad are meaningless unless you're really talking about a specific place. And we all know gentrification is great in some areas and terrible in other areas. And we need to really kind of understand those spatial dynamics.
Excellent.